Firstly, I would like to welcome Daniel Silk. Daniel is an independent political analyst, author, and keynote speaker, specializing in South African and international politics. He has a specialist interest in political parties and elections, and is a renowned futurist, lecturing widely on issues surrounding global change, volatility, and the future of the world. He is regarded one of South Africa's leading political commentators and most passionate public speaker.
There we go. Right, can you all hear me at the back? Can you all hear me? Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you very, very much, Mazars, for inviting me to come and talk to you here this morning. It's a pleasure to be here for a variety of reasons, other than my respect for your particular company, and more importantly, the fact that I live extremely close, within walking distance of this venue. I have a little hut underneath the roller coaster outside, and that's where I spend most of my time. I'm here to really give you sort of a contextual view of where this budget is in terms of the broader South African political economy. It's one thing, of course, to look at the figures, and we will look at the figures, of course, in Di's presentation after mine, and the figures are critical because ultimately it's what's coming out of your back pocket, in particular, as a result of this budget. But let's put the budget into some context as to where we're going, and it was, I think, a budget yesterday. If we look at this rather sort of amusing quote from one of our well-known heads of state across the world in the last decade or two. Yeah, I think we did have a budget yesterday, as George W. Bush perhaps said about some of his own budgets. But in the South African context, I do think that sometimes we need some fortification to get us through discussing the matters of the day in this country in particular. I'm sorry that Mazars did not spring for something stronger with your coffee or your fruit juice this morning. If you need to bring out a hip flask during the course of my presentation, I can see you from here, but I promise I won't tell. Now, the big context of this budget, the big context to me as a political analyst, clearly, is what happened 13, 14 days ago. And all of you witnessed this particular event, I'm pretty sure. More of you than ever before were tuned into the parliamentary television channel or associated channels to watch this drama unfold. I mean, who needs generations in South Africa when you can have this on your screen? Now, clearly, this kind of event was a shock to the system. I felt a shock to my system as an analyst and as somebody who, I expected to a degree levels of disruption on that particular evening, but I'm not quite sure whether we expected the ramifications, the totality of what happened during the day, the signal jamming issue, and of course the violence that occurred even within the hallowed halls of our National Assembly. So the budget occurs within this context. It was vitally necessary, in a sense, for the Minister of Finance to take us away from this. I always sort of feel this is like a sort of a flash forward, a nightmare what we might have about the future, and we, all of us in South Africa, were exposed to this potential nightmare, and hopefully we're not going to get to this particular scenario. It was a chance for us to rebuild. We saw reality, or at least one scenario of reality. Hopefully we can restore our democracy over the next number of years. So it was critical, therefore, that Treasury, in effect, bring us back to serious business. And to a degree, I think the budget did accomplish that. It needed to move sentiment in South Africa. Sentiment had turned relatively negative, especially, of course, since the State of the Nation address, but sentiment was negative well prior to that for a number of reasons that I will articulate. Did it change sentiment? Did the budget have that effect on us? Did it have that effect on a foreign investor looking to come into South Africa, or a domestic investor here in South Africa looking to plow cash domestically, or still looking to plow cash perhaps outside of our country? I'm not quite sure that the budget had enough sentiment, positive sentiment drivers in it, but at least it showed a sort of steady as she goes approach. The budget occurs within a much more fragile political environment in South Africa. I'm a political analyst. I like fragility. I like change. So to me, I never fear change, and I think all of us will go through another period of witnessing political change in South Africa. But clearly, when a hegemonic political party like the ANC, and it's no different to any other big nationalist hegemonic political party, starts to fray at the edges, starts to lose a little bit of power here and there, starts to feel a little bit more insecure, well, it finds itself looking inwards. It finds itself protecting its own power base. And within that context, we saw the budget occur where there was little room for fresh or new policy initiatives. It was a budget really where the Minister of Finance's hands were somewhat tied by the complexities of the politics of the day in South Africa. These complexities are well known for all of us. We know that we're in a much more competitive political environment than we've ever been before in South Africa. And suddenly, there's this group of people who are really taking the debate, I suppose. Whether you agree with them or not, they're taking the debate to the ruling party. Yeah, I do believe that the EFF certainly is obviously a potential political disaster for South Africa, should they indeed come to power or hold any kind of balance of power in South Africa into the future. But they've changed the nature of our parliamentary chamber debate, and of course they also pose some sort of electoral threat to the ANC, particularly in Gauteng. Not just the EFF, but the DA as well. And in a sense, when we look at those local government election results from the national election results from last year, you saw how vulnerable the ANC became in the big metropoles in Gauteng, the Tshwanis, the Ekurhulenis, the city of Johannesburg, and in Port Elizabeth as well, I might add, where the ANC vote dropped to below 50%. If that is carried through into those local government elections next year, if the ANC does not win overall control over Tshwane, Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, I might add, I say that to people in Cape Town, the capital of South Africa, well, look at the symbolic effect that's going to have. So to me, shoring up power, you have to be a fancy analyst, shoring up political power is absolutely crucial. The ANC is more vulnerable because of its own internal difficulties within its alliance, particularly on the trade union flank of its alliance. It's fighting a rearguard action from populists who look to the EFF, but certainly, and I think more importantly, it's fighting its own trade unions within the alliance and those that have been excluded from COSATU as well. That's fragility for you in our political setup that we've never seen before in South Africa. So what effectively has the government done? Well, the government, of course, has locked in more workers into government employ over the course of the last 10, 12 years or so. Government has got bigger. And when government gets bigger, it costs you and me. Now, it's a fairly simple concept to see how tied the minister's hands were. When you look at the wage bill that the minister spoke about yesterday, when you look at that spending and you look to see how many more government employees there are over the course of the last decade, well, we are bringing people into government. The private sector haven't been hiring. The government sector have been hiring. We're bringing people into the broader state ambit. We're giving those people security. We're giving jobs. We're giving decent salaries. And in a sense, from a government point of view, we're locking them in to supporting the government because that's where their monthly salary comes from. There's a political ramification for this increase in the amount of those employed by government. We've rolled out social income grants, quite rightly, I might add, to indigent South Africans. And we're continuing to roll out these grants, and we saw yesterday in the budget, again, reference made to this. Perhaps the percentage increases in social income grants that were announced yesterday are more manageable than before. But when you, over the course of the last decade, roll out social income grants to nearly 17 million South Africans who are now reliant upon that check effectively, well, you can see trouble coming from the fiscus. You can see a potential deficit in order. More South Africans now receive grants, I might add, than are currently employed. And when you look at that kind of juxtaposition of where we are in South Africa, it's not sustainable in the medium to longer term. We need more people employed in South Africa than those receiving income grants. And that's the critical test for me in this kind of budget. Did it say anything about alleviating unemployment? Did it say anything about reversing that particular trend that we've seen in the country over the course of the last 10 years? And I'm not really sure that it did. We've got, of course, the well-known and much vaunted National Development Plan, a document that I tend to like, although I don't necessarily agree with everything in it. It's a 400-page tome, and I'm not quite sure how many of us have still read cover to cover all 400 pages. The document has been resurrected as a goal in Minister Nene's speech yesterday. And he referred to the National Development Plan quite a few times, and I'm happy that he did, because I thought this plan had got a little lost over the course of the last number of months. We know that there are disagreements within the ruling alliance about the National Development Plan. The fundamentals of the plan that call for raising employment through faster economic growth, improving the quality of education, skills development, building the capability and the capacity of the state, those goals of the NDP are certainly highly noble. And that's why I support the NDP. One of the critical issues for me in this NDP, obviously, other than getting to the magical 5% per annum GDP growth rate that the plan calls for in order to make a successful South Africa, the other key issue for me in this plan is creating a capable state, making that bureaucracy really work. And I might add, trying to depoliticize the bureaucracy, because the only way this bureaucracy is going to work in South Africa, the only way we're going to get better state-owned enterprises, if they are to remain within the ambit of the state, is to depoliticize the state and encourage efficiencies that will occur as a result of the depoliticization of the civil service. We saw yesterday extensive mention made to the parastatals, I might add, to the parastatals. Those parastatals are locked into the ruling alliance through multiple connections, ideological connections, business connections. And there's no indication that government really wants to shed its ideological commitment to the broad concept of state intervention and the state-owned enterprise model. There are over 700 state-owned enterprises of a variety of sizes in South Africa. And on the basis of that, you've seen the losses and the bailouts and the loan guarantees incurred by SAA and by Eskom, and of course also by the rather unfortunately ailing South African Post Office. So again, the minister's hands are tied. If you're going to follow an ideologically driven policy of encouraging a developmental state with a big focus on state-owned enterprises, you're going to have to be prepared to bail out these guys time after time after time. And again, that constraint we saw again come through in the budget yesterday. Ultimately, of course, Minister Nene is working in an environment in which he's locked into some sort of ideological straitjacket. One always gets the impression very often in listening to Treasury that Treasury is the real conscience of government. Treasury are the guys who have to implement, find the cash, balance the books, and in a sense they've got to battle the ideologues that exist today within the ruling alliance. That ruling alliance today is certainly more divided, I would argue, on future policy than ever before. And Minister Nene's budget had to be the ultimate balancing act. It's a balancing act in a sense to keep that alliance relatively intact in advance of those very important local government elections next year, in which the ANC will be under pressure for the first time in these big metros. So the budget yesterday, in accordance with this general state of confusion within the ruling alliance, this general state of ideological malaise in the ruling alliance, provides us with more examples of mixed signals in South Africa. There are plenty of mixed signals, and you've seen evidence of this over the course of the last while. President Zuma quite rightly goes to Davos and says South Africa is open for business. That's what he says, and it all looks good, and the PR stuff looks good. But then there's a barrage of legislation that we are being faced with, and it still has to be clarified and ironed out and discussed in committee and evidence taken, piece after piece of legislation that either can negatively affect sentiment about South Africa or in fact can really affect our economy. And I'm particularly concerned about many of these bills that I've put up on the screen, but of course my big concern, certainly for the moment, are on issues surrounding land, because I think redistribution of land is important, but I think the messy nature of what's being proposed in terms of the new land heritage bill is something that I think can create negative sentiment about the country and indeed can also attack food security in South Africa. All of these issues together, again, providing mixed signals to South Africa. And those mixed signals, again, are exacerbated by this confused relationship between the government, the labor movement, and the private sector. government itself is not quite sure whether it really will embrace the private sector. On the one hand, it says, yes, we want more private sector involvement, but on the other hand, there's a suspicion, a negativity towards the capitalist or private sector interests, certainly within South Africa. Until this relationship is sorted out, I don't think we're going to get adequate economic growth in South Africa. This, to me, is at the core of why we are languishing, I think, at 2% growth rates. These sort of policy unknowns, this inertia, these roads to nowhere that we go on, again, clearly affect our economy. And the ultimate issue here is that politics is driving economics in South Africa at the moment. There's always a debate as to whether economics drives politics, or whether economics is the key driver, or whether politics is the key driver. And I think politics today drives economics. Keeping the alliance as relatively intact as possible is, I would argue, Jacob Zuma's main goal for the moment, and that means acquiescing, at least, to more populist demands, perhaps from the EFF on land and on labor, or to the trade unions, certainly, on labor. And I think we've seen that come through in the State of the Nation address. We've seen it come through in other pronouncements from government. They are looking over their left shoulder more than ever before and trying at least to placate those who may think about leaving for a trade union movement or the EFF into sticking around with the ANC at least for another period and at least into next year. But look, it's not just South Africa's own domestic politics. And you can sort of breathe a sigh of relief. It's not just our own politics that affects our economy. The broader world we know have great ramification on us. And we all live in a very interconnected world. It's a cliche, but for goodness sake, it's real. Europe's economy, it's still in part on life support, I might add. And you know, I'm not sure about the relationship between these two. I'm not quite sure who the dominant partner is. They're all fighting for dominance in Europe at the moment. But this little country, 11.5 million people in Greece, 11.5 million. Look at the effect that crisis has had on Europe, on the potential domino effect that could be created if Greece moves out of the euro, if it defaults, on what could happen in Spain or Italy or Portugal or any of the unfortunately named pigs groups of countries in the periphery of Europe. This has an effect on us. Europe's still a very important trading partner with South Africa, notwithstanding the rise of Asia. Of course, globally, we've seen a shift in economic sentiment, an improvement in the United States, in US GDP in particular. US GDP today leading the developing world by a fairly long shot as well. We've seen the oil price plunge over the course of the last 6 to 9 months or so. And you can listen to me with a degree of jaundiced skepticism, I suppose, but I love looking at projections from economists, and I love looking at graphs, and what we need to do is you need to interrogate all of these graphs and projections and forecasts a year or two later. Don't just look at how they are today. Here's the graph from Oxford Economics, a very renowned, of course, economic think tank, which shows the effect. It shows the effect of a lower oil price on the GDPs of a number of countries across the world. And what's interesting here in this particular graph is that Oxford Economics predict that South Africa would be amongst the best beneficiaries of a lower oil price, largely because we import most of our oil. The Philippines would be number 1, the Slovak Republic 2, South Africa would be the 3rd best recipient of a lower oil price to boost our GDP. And then what happens yesterday? Whatever we gained, in a sense, through the reduction in the price of oil, in terms of your pockets, in terms of the pockets of the consumer, was taken away from us in terms of an 80-cent plus levy, a series of levies on fuel, whatever we had gained more or less. And if we assume that the oil price is going to plateau now at these lower levels, and the price has actually bounced back off the bottom as it happens, we will see a larger than 80 cents price increase over the next 2 months here in South Africa. The effects of that have simply been lost. You can be happy, though, that you don't live in Norway or in Russia or in Venezuela or in Nigeria, where the real effect of the decline in oil is going to be felt on budgets. The broader global environment has an impact. That broad commodity super cycle that we've been speaking about for the last number of years, well, you can see on the graph. You can see precious metals, industrial metals, and coal, the prices have dropped and dropped precipitously over the course of the last year, year and a half or so. If we at a plateau in that commodity cycle, it may improve in the next few years, but if we're at a plateau, it's no surprise that the minister's hands are tied in terms of the receipts and revenues generated from our mining industry, in terms of a weaker currency, as most developing markets that rely upon commodities have now weaker currencies. So again, if you look at the figures and you look at the economic projections over the course of the next few years and you look to see who's doing well and who's not doing well, our projected GDP growth for the next year is 2%. 2%, that's all it is. Nowhere near the 5% that the NDP says we need to have in terms of our GDP. But we are also going to be buffeted by a slightly lower growth rate coming out of China. Chinese growth now down to 7.4% last year, projected in a sense to drop to under 7% in 2015. There is a sliding scale for China's GDP that will affect all those countries that are increasingly reliant upon that Chinese growth story for their future. Russia, too, we know, moving into negative growth territory, and Brazil, the great star of the last 10 years or so globally, moving perilously close to a recession over the course of the next year. So again, the BRICS countries of the world, the much vaunted BRICS countries, many of them, perhaps with the exception of India, that looks a lot better, but many of them, not the flavor of the month quite as they were, and we are part of that slightly negative sentiment to the BRICS element in developing markets. Of course, my friends, of course, it goes without saying that this issue is one of the key impediments to our growth into the future, and I'm not going to speak too much about this. I need to get off quickly just in case the lights go out in time. So, Minister Nene stands up in front of Parliament yesterday, gives the budget. I must say, he looked a lot better than when he was in 2008 and he slipped off that chair at the SABC studios into one of the more embarrassing moments when that chair collapsed in front of the television cameras. He looked a lot better, and I must say he learned to speak with an autocue machine, which I think most of our politicians need to do. The question is, and here's a key differential between him and, of course, Trevor Manuel. I like to look at senior members of public office, and I like to see whether they have gravitas. Do they have that sort of that intangible feeling that whatever they say really is going to happen or really has got meaning? Trevor Manuel had gravitas when he spoke. Pravin Gordhan had great gravitas when he spoke, in my humble opinion. And the strange thing was, both Gordhan and Manuel were pretty senior members of the ANC itself, on the National Executive Committee of the ANC. And Nhlanhla Nene is not quite in that same league, perhaps not yet because it was his first budget, but he doesn't carry with him, in a sense, the weight of the political party. When I listened to Manuel or I listened to Gordhan, I sort of felt as though they would have an influence in their political party. Not quite sure if it was the same gravitas that Nene had. And the more I listened to the speech and the more I read the speech late last night, I just felt that Nene was like a sweeper in soccer. Those of you that play soccer will know what I mean. The sweeper who is the last line of defense, in a sense, to try and protect the goal. And I just got that feeling from that budget yesterday. That's exactly what he was, trying to defend what really are so many policy own goals in our South African context. There's Nene, I think, the last line of defense. So Nene has got to deal with all of these issues. Hands tied, constraints, political constraints. He pontificates, he speaks in a climate in which there's good and bad in South Africa. We know what we're good at. This is a comparative chart of how competitive we are globally. The World Economic Forum do this very, very useful survey every 18 months or so, and we are very competitive. In fact, we're global leaders when it comes to the regulation of our securities exchange, when it comes to the soundness of our banks, the strength of investor protection in South Africa. We're in the top 10, in the top 3 for that matter. We do pretty well. But just to spoil your morning, Minister Nene has to speak and has to talk about large budgetary allocations to areas that we do not perform well in. Look at the survey. The survey shows that in the case of 148 countries surveyed in the world, 148 countries, we are 148 out of 148 when it comes to the quality of maths and science in our schools. 148 out of 148, almost full marks for being bottom of the pile. We are 148 out of 148 when it comes to our labor relations regime in South Africa. Clearly, education and labor remain at the heart of many of our problems, and we can throw money at it, which we do. There's no shortage of money or budgetary allocations for education, for health, but do we get value for our money? And that question remains after the budget. What does the budget do in terms of the perilous state of youth unemployment in South Africa? Now put it anywhere between 48 and about 60%. 30 to 40% of all South Africans are now out of work. Does the budget incentivize job creation? Yes, there were incentives for the small business sector, which I think are very positive, but I'm not convinced it goes nearly anywhere to really redressing this in a long-term solution. Our mining contribution to GDP has been in decline over the course of the last number of years due to a variety of global reasons, technical reasons, and political reasons within South Africa. Does the budget really address this? Perhaps it doesn't, and we need more broader policy initiatives to get this all right. We have an opportunity now in South Africa. Our rand is relatively low. Commodities are going to take a back seat for the moment. We should be addressing issues of our manufacturing sector, where manufacturing production has been in decline for the course of the last number of years. We should be incentivizing manufacturers in South Africa. Was there enough of that in the budget? I couldn't see that much. Our labor costs have been increasing in South Africa quite considerably. There are many other countries that are much more expensive than us, I must tell you. But if you look here, you'll see South Africa is now very similar to Korea. Look at that. The Netherlands there, Korea, South Africa, and the US. We're almost as expensive as a worker in the United States. That's an issue in terms of getting our growth. Whatever the figures are, whatever the allocations are, these are issues that we should be looking at. There, of course, South Africa. And I think importantly, and the Minister alluded to this, wage settlements in South Africa have been pretty positive for workers. Workers have got wage settlements well above the current rate of inflation. Somehow sort of redressing that, trying to get those wage settlements to be more in line with inflation is going to be the minister's big task. And we all know unions are going to be chomping at the bit now again for fresh wage negotiations come the middle of the year. Can we now restore a semblance of reality to wage negotiations in a politically charged environment? That's going to be the core issue. There's a political issue here. It's not so much from the economic side. So we saw in the budget high levels of government spend. And these are taken from the Budget Review Book, which I urge you all to have a look at, because to me the Budget Review Book is a lot more interesting than the budget itself. There's so much hidden in that Budget Review, and there's so many interesting facets and aspects to analyze. Government spending, you can see the black line indicates social grants, and you can just see government spending on social grants, and you can just see the red line, interest on debt. Look at how interest on debt has risen substantially, and of course social grants. More government spending. We've seen government spending on education. Look at that spend. We've got the cash and we're spending. But there should not be any room for us being 148th in the world out of 148 on maths and science. We're not getting value for our buck. You can see the amount of money spent on social protection, of course, on income grants as well. You can just see also, by the way, in that particular chart, that there's a lot more we need to do on housing and community amenities. Look how we haven't spent sufficiently on that, and hopefully part of the big rollout, and we saw in Gauteng, in their State of the Nation, State of the Province address, how the Gauteng Premier announced substantial infrastructure upliftments, particularly for township areas, that I absolutely applaud. All of that spending, of course, equals debt. And I suppose here's the rub for me looking beyond this budget. And Minister Nene quite rightly warned South Africans yesterday. You can't go on incurring this debt with these low levels of GDP growth, and I might add, and I'll add on, with an insufficient number of middle-class taxpayers to equally carry the burden. You've got to up those middle-class taxpayer numbers if those debt projections, that this comes from the budget review, it's from Treasury's own projections, continue to rise and rise quite dramatically. Our debt to GDP ratio in South Africa, well, it's now at about 45, 46% or so. Most economists would argue that we should not have that debt to GDP anywhere above 50% for a developing country like ours. We've been creeping up Due to increased government debts over the course of the last year, Minister Nene said yesterday our debt to GDP will stabilize at 44-45%. I'm going to watch that extensively over the course of the next few years. What then was this budget memorable for? It wasn't memorable for growth. It was memorable for taxes in ways to alleviate debt and alleviate those policy constraints and inefficiencies that we've lived with, and Di will talk about that. So, we left in a political malaise, I suppose. We heard good words from the minister yesterday. I liked so many aspects of the speech. Will he deliver, and will his government deliver? Does he have the credibility? Does government have the credibility to deliver? Does government have the credibility to cut back on unnecessarily and wasteful expenditure when this kind of survey shows how much money we actually lose in South Africa to corruption? Does government have the credibility? I mean, two gentlemen, I think, who are extremely capable, and I'm happy that the economy and local government in particular is in Pravin Gordhan's hands. But credibility, of course, leadership, critical in South Africa going forward. And, I'd like to believe everything, but time will tell, because these issues of credibility and leadership play on our ability to really take government seriously. So finally, I might have been a little critical, but ultimately I happen to love this country, and I strongly would urge you to keep calm and carry on. There's some very good reasons to continue to operate, invest, and work in South Africa. We issued $1.7 billion of treasury bonds in July of last year. They were oversubscribed 3 times. Investors still wanted to buy our bonds. Our private sector, outstanding. They look as though they're going to turn around retail in the Southern Hemisphere, if Woolworths is to be believed. We still attract the lion's share of foreign direct investment in Africa compared to any other African country, notwithstanding the excellent African growth that Hilton mentioned to you. We're still an attractive destination. And for our business here in South Africa, population growth across the African continent is going to be the biggest driver for our business going forward, even in a stagnant South African market. What opportunity, in fact, there is. Just to make you feel good, there might be fighting and fisticuffs in our parliament, but it occurs elsewhere in the world as well. That's the parliament in Ankara in Turkey, where they go for each other, let me tell you. We are not alone. There they are in Kiev, my friends, in Kiev in the Ukraine granted a country under stress, but look at those politicians there in Kiev. It's not all bad here in this country. But finally, in my last little quote and slide, nugget of wisdom, which doesn't come from me, it's a very good little quote. It comes from a young Ghanaian entrepreneur by the name of Israel Moore Ayivo. And he said this last year. He's a young, hotshot Ghanaian. If you don't have any good idea, you are likely to waste money if it's given to you. If you don't have an idea, you can't even know how much money you need. This is because it's your ideas that give you the cost to pay. There's a young entrepreneur from Ghana. Wise words, I think. We need a lot better ideas in South Africa if we are going to make this budget really work. Thanks very much for your attention.